कोविड के बाद इंडिया का 2 साल 2 years पोस्ट कोविड इंडिया had a terrific economic boom. रफली सितंबर 21 से सितंबर 23 7-8% इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ रही. As the post-COVID revenge spending boom dies away, it's leading to a cyclical economic downturn, and it is all but certain in this that the middle class will be the biggest casualty of this post-COVID cyclical economic downturn.
So folks, welcome to the latest episode of Coffee and Investing with Saurabh. I'm Nandita, the economist at Marcellus Investment Managers, and today I'm joined by Marcellus's CIO and my colleague Saurabh Mukherjee. In these episodes, our endeavor is to discuss and unravel things that pertain to investing. And today we are going to be discussing something that affects us all, that is the squeeze on middle class incomes. So Saurabh, welcome to the episode of Coffee and Investing.
Thank you so much for hosting, Nandita. Thank you.
Right. So let's dive right in. So what constitutes the middle class? Because there's a lot of definitions used by multiple people to describe what the middle class is. What, according to you, is the middle class, and what income categories or consumption basket describes it?
Look, the lazy definition of the middle class, right? The lazy definition is जो लोग बीच में हैं. So by that definition, तो every country will have a middle class forever because there'll always be somebody बीच में. I think a better way to define the middle class, right? A more accurate way to define the middle class is those people who are financially equidistant from the rich and the poor, right? Middle matlab financially equidistant from the rich and the poor. And thankfully, you and I can use India's income tax data to identify such people. So if you use the latest income tax data, in the class of Indians, that 50% of India, which is financially equidistant between rich and poor, is those earning between 5 lakhs to a crore. So as per IT data, earning between 5 lakhs to a crore per annum, right? Roughly 40 million families, 40 million income tax filers fall in that category. They account for 70% of India's income tax collections, right? So adhi tax paying abadi, half the tax paying abadi, 40 million people earning between 5 lakhs per annum to 1 crore per annum. 70% India का tax collection इनसे आता है. Now assume that each of these 40 million families has roughly 4 people. So करीबन 150 million people, 150 million people in the Indian middle class, 40 million families. This will be our definition of the Indian middle class.
Fantastic. And what heralded this rise of the Indian middle class? Because we keep hearing about it, that it's the Indian middle class consumes a lot. So what happened historically?
So look, I mean, there's a whole bunch of historical work which shows that, many thousands of years ago, millennia ago, India had a middle class, people who were artisans, they formed guilds, and they were the Purane Zamane ka middle class. And a lady called Manisha Pandey has written a terrific book called Middle Class India, Driving Change in the 21st Century, in which she convincingly argues कि पुराने ज़माने में भी 1000, 2000, 3000 साल पहले भी we had a middle class, right? But for the purposes of what we understand the middle class today, right, I'll focus on a more anglicized definition. It was the British in the 19th century who created a anglicized class of Indians so that the Indians would administer the country while the British enjoyed themselves at the golf course or at the race course or at the club drinking gin and tonic, right? So the anglicized middle class that you and I belong to in India today, and I suspect many people watching this podcast belong to today, they owe their origins to the British and the whole British construct around creating what was called the Indian Civil Service, uska exam, uski padhai likhai, right? And this goes back to somewhere around the 1850s. These people went on to create the freedom movement, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, the entire leadership of the Indian freedom movement came from this anglicized middle class. Thus, when the British exited the country, these anglicized folks took charge of the country. Just to be clear, these were Indians who embraced British education and Western culture, but they were against the British. Right? It's a very neat mental divide they were able to pull off. It's quite a neat trick. They're saying, we don't want the British, but hey, we are happy with the British education, English mein padhai likhai, and we are happy to embrace Western culture because we think of that being as a driver of our upward mobility. So in 1947, this class grabbed the reins of power. After Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, Jawaharlal Nehru became the residing DT of the middle class, and that's how this anglicized elite created by the British took charge of independent India.
So I reckon that after the whole political power was taken up by this middle class, as you define it, post independence, they would have definitely used it to their benefit, helping them ascend the education system, ascend the political system, and all of that. So obviously, they were at the apex of everything that was happening in India. So what happened then? I mean, what is happening to
So
these
I think,
Indians
look,
now?
you're right. I mean, effectively, when the anglicized middle class took charge of the country, they were the bosses, and in Mumbai language, they did setting. The setting that they did was, on the face of it, they would pay lip service to socialism. On the face of it, they would be lip service to socialism, looking after the poor, doing good stuff for the poor. But effectively, policy was rigged in favor of the policy was rigged post 1947 in favor of the anglicized, well-educated middle class and against the poor. Right? There are many different facets to it. Those who are interested can refer to a lovely book by Pavan Verma called The Great Indian Middle Class. But let me give you a couple of examples of how policy was rigged in favor of the middle class and against the poor, whilst all the time paying lip service to socialism and गरीबों का देखभाल. So the Constitution of India, right, in 1950, as everybody knows, we adopted the Constitution of Free India. Article 45 of the Constitution provides for free and compulsory education for all children under the age of 14. So middle class ने बोला, बिल्कुल boss, we sign up to this. But where did we invest our resources after independence? We invested it in higher education, in the famous IITs, subsequently the IIMs, in a very advanced university system. Even today, by standards of emerging markets, India's university system is very high quality. It's given us a well-educated elite. India's IT services revolution, for example, owes its existence to this high-class education system. But the cost was that we deprived primary education of the resources it deserved, and as a result, from 1947 to the present day, we have some of the highest number of illiterate people in the world. Even today, 20% of the population is illiterate. At a time when, say, a country like China, which became free from colonialism around the same time as us, China has 100% literacy, right? And if you look at this rigging of education policy, throughout lip services paid that education सबके लिए होगा. Even more recently, right? Remember 15 years ago, 20 years ago, India expedited right to education. उसके बाद भी कुछ खास कुछ बदला नहीं. We still have an ecosystem where the best education goes to affluent people in universities which are still subsidized by the government, and school education is deprived of resources, as people famously know. Many school teachers in government schools, many school teachers never turn up, and the results of that are the rural areas and in less affluent areas of the big cities, the poor are deprived of high quality education. As we went away from 47, as the middle class got entrenched, right, in the levers of power, they used the levers of power to do rent seeking. So remember, to the 50s, 60s, 70s, the license permit Raj was in full throttle, right? पूरा मतलब apex पे था license permit Raj. And who were the people manning the gears and the levers of the license permit Raj? The anglicized middle class. तो इन लोगों ने दबा के पैसा कमाया, rent seeking किया license permit Raj में, and they used the fruits of rent seeking, they used the fruits of corruption in the license permit Raj to get their children set up. राइट. सो उनकी नेक्स्ट जनरेशन को भी अपने अगले सैकड़ों जनरेशन को उन्होंने सेटअप करने की कोशिश की. आइदर दे वुड गेट देयर चिल्ड्रन पुट इनटू plum jobs in corporate India, or if they could get away with it in the political and civil service, or we created this great giant construct of entrance exams, where using the veneer of egalitarianism, एंट्रेंस एग्जाम्स गिव द वेनियर ऑफ एगैलिटेरियनिज्म, राइट. उसमें मिडिल क्लास के बच्चे दबा के पढ़ाई लिखाई करके एंट्रेंस एग्जाम फोड़ के दे वुड असेंड टू द टॉप ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट लाइफ. एंड दिस वाज एक्चुअली वेरी क्लेवर कॉन्स्ट्रक्ट. इफ अ सिविल सर्वेंट गेट्स हिज रिलेटिव्स a piece of land or permits using corrupt means, it obviously looks very bad. But hey, if the same civil servant takes a lot of bribes, gets his kids the best education money can buy, and those kids then kill it in the joint entrance exam, then in middle class eyes, बच्चे ने अच्छा किया है तो justified है. So India used the joint entrance exams to give credibility to the middle class capture of policy. And again, as I said, still haunts India because it's created deep social divides, which make us one of the least equal countries in the world till today. So massive implications of the middle class capture of post 1947 India. The good news for those who are watching is the further we moved away from 47, the weaker the middle class's grip became on policy and politics. Right, as we moved away from 47 through the 70s and 80s, the poor asserted themselves in the ballot box. The poor asserted themselves in a ballot box, and especially through the 80s and 90s, a new class of politics hold in India. A new class of politician emerged in India, not just the BJP, but also more vibrant regional parties, Trinamool Congress, BRS down south, DMK, IDMK, SP, BSP in north, the Akali Dal in Punjab, right? A more vibrant class of regional politician emerged. And these people had no love lost for gin and tonic drinking, English educated, convent school educated, club going middle class Indians, right? And thus the grip that middle class had on Indian politics and policy weakened as we entered the current century. And my reckoning is in the next 10 years, this grip is going to be all but taken away. I think it will herald massive changes. The grip of middle class Indians on politics and policy all but disappears. It will herald massive change, social change, political change, and economic change in our country.
Right. So I would like to delve in deeper into the last bit that you just spoke about, which is, the losing of grip of the middle class over all levers of power or economic status, everything. So what exactly is happening right now? Why do you say that the middle class is losing its ploy, losing its game against the others, against the newly risen elite or the local regional parties that are coming up? So what dynamic is playing out there?
Okay, so if we let go of history, right? Let's focus on the here and the now. I think there are three major ways. In which the middle class is become economically unmoved. Pehla panga, first issue is that salaries, earnings, right? As per the IT data, income tax data, middle class earnings have stagnated at around 10.5 lakhs per year for the last 10 years, right? So nominal terms में flat है नंदिता, उसका मतलब real terms में middle class incomes have halved in the last 10 years, right? Massive issue, right? You can imagine, right, what it does. People want to live a better life, but real terms में, मतलब inflation adjusted terms में कमाई आधी हो गई है. That means the middle class has had to load up on a lot of debt, right? Second issue is automation, robotization, right? AI. So whether it's in factories, whether it is in offices, the machines are taking over conventional middle class jobs. So the simplest example being, say, a teller in a bank, right? A teller in a bank is a classical middle class job. उसकी ज़रूरत धीरे धीरे नहीं रहेगी, right? एक तो ATM पहले आया, right? The first layer of automation was the ATM. Second layer will be a bot gradually replacing the teller in the bank. Effectively, the ATM is the first layer of automation. More sophisticated layers of automation are going to come from the AI world, where the bots will be trained on generative AI. So robotization in factories, automation in the offices, getting rid of middle class jobs. Dusra bada panga. And the third issue is the cyclical downturn. So COVID के बाद India का 2 साल, 2 years post COVID, India had a terrific economic boom. Roughly September 21 से September 23, 7-8% economic growth रही. As the post-COVID revenge spending boom dies away, it's leading to a cyclical economic downturn, and it is all but certain in this that the middle class will be the biggest casualty of this post-COVID cyclical economic downturn. ये last issue cyclical है, but पहले दो issues, a massive upsurge in middle class debt on the back of stagnating incomes, and AI, robotization and automation robbing middle class of the jobs. Those two are structural issues. I think they will have a massive influence, detrimental influence on the middle class over the next decade.
Right. So let's just peel this factor by factor. So the first thing that you mentioned is the debt factor, where middle class is, getting themselves indebted. So I would like to ask, where exactly are you seeing the stress evolve in debt? Because if they're, taking debt for house construction or getting property, that is not that big a problem, right? Because the property prices or the land prices will only appreciate or at least time correct. So they won't actually fall. So it's against a tangible property that they're taking the loan, so it won't go bad or there won't be that much of a stress. So why do you say that debt is such a big issue for the middle class specifically?
So, Nandita, you're right. The property piece is reasonably all right. You're right to say that property prices are holding up. And to be fair, even in that great 2015 to 2023 property stagnation, prices held up, right? So, India में बड़ा property market correction बहुत सालों तक हुआ नहीं है. I think the three areas of concern would be as follows. The first thing is just look at the amount of borrowing the middle class has done, right? So, if we use RBI data, credit card and retail loans now account for around 11% of the banking system का credit outstanding. 10 साल पहले ये नंबर था 4%. So credit card and retail loans have gone from 4 to 11% of the banking system credit outstanding. It gives you a sense of how much the banking system has lent to the middle class over the last decade. And the middle class, remember, has needed that money because उनकी incomes नहीं बढ़ रही, खर्चे बढ़ रहे हैं, खाना पीने का खर्चा बढ़ रहा है, रेंट बढ़ रहा है, स्कूल की फीस बढ़ रही है, मेडिकल कॉस्ट बढ़ रही है, ट्रांसपोर्ट कॉस्ट बढ़ रही है. सो मिडिल क्लास हैज बोरोड हैंड ओवर फिस्ट एंड द बैंकिंग सिस्टम हैज सेड आओ बेटा ये लो पैसे. 4% becomes 11% of banking system loans, right? Second is the RBI itself. The RBI has published something called publishes every year something called the Financial Stability Review. And the recent RBI FSR, the Financial Stability Review, says करीबन 45% of India's borrowers are subprime, right? Out of those subprime borrowers, subprime is 45% of middle class borrowers. Out of those subprime borrowers, the borrowing that they're doing, 48% of the debt, करीबन आधा debt that the subprime borrower has taken on is for consumption related activities. So रोजमर्रा की consumption के लिए आधा debt ले रही है. So subprime borrowers 45% of total borrowers in middle class India, और उनकी जो borrowing है आधा borrowing हो रहा है day to day रोजमर्रा की consumption के लिए, right? And the तीसरा जो मुद्दा है is, and if we put all this RBI data together, Nandita, and our research suggests that 5 to 10% of middle class India is in a debt trap. Now, what is a debt trap? A debt trap is when people with modest incomes have taken on multiple loans which they're never going to be able to repay, right? So it's a reasonably easy set of maths to show that there are 5 to 10% of middle class Indians who've taken on multiple loans that they'll never be able to repay. I'll quickly summarize this maths, right? This is, I think, important maths for those who are watching. If you are a middle class Indian with a lot of debt, I think there are debt counseling services. It's worth reaching out to them. And this problem is going to get worse. So don't take it lightly. Now, just to give you the maths on why I reckon 5 to 10% of middle class Indians are caught in a debt trap, right? So there's plenty of surveys which suggest two-thirds of middle class Indians have availed of personal loans, right? So 67%, two-thirds of middle class Indians have availed of personal loans, right? The data from the RBI shows that a quarter of middle class Indians, a quarter of borrowers, sorry. So 2/3 of middle class Indians have taken up personal loans. Data from the RBI shows a quarter of borrowers have credit cards plus personal loans plus another high ticket loan, right? So RBI का data बोल रहा है quarter of borrowers have a credit card plus a personal loan plus another big ticket loan, right? And finally, data from Civil is showing that 45% of borrowers are subprime. These are the poorer borrowers. And as I said a few minutes ago, for these borrowers, half of their borrowing is to finance day-to-day consumption. So अगर ये numbers को multiply करें तो करीबन 5 to 10% of middle class India is in debt trap. They are not going to be able to repay their loans in full. And if anything, with each passing year, the situation is going to get worse. By the way, this is showing up already in delinquency, non-performing asset data for a range of borrowers. Microfinance is taken by poorer segment of society that's in bad shape. One notch slightly richer people is personal loans. Personal loans already 9-10% of those loans have gone sour. Credit cards, 5-6% of those loans, 5-6% of the loans outstanding have gone sour. Two-wheeler finance, right? Two-wheeler finance, scooters, motorbikes, the growing delinquency there. So the only bit holding up is the point you made. Housing loans are holding up. Loans against property are holding up, and thankfully so far car loans are still holding up. बाकी विकेट गिर चुके हैं.
Okay. But tell me something, that India has typically been a high saving country, right? It has always been a saver. So why can't the middle class tide over this whole debt thing, the debt trap that you're talking about, by just putting hands into their saving kitty and just repay all the debt and be okay to go forward? So why do you think that is not happening?
So look, I mean, it's a it's a deep question. Proper answer will take, I think, a proper full podcast in full. But again, going back to what is the data telling us? The RBI's data and the RBI itself is repeatedly telling the public that net household savings, net matlab household savings minus household borrowings as a percentage of income is at its lowest level in 50 years, right? So net household savings पिट चुकी है. And if we look at the RBI time series data, right, करीबन 5-6 साल पहले, basically after COVID, net household saving took a real pounding, right? And as I said, it's already at a very low level, right? What's even more tragic is looking at the data is that over the last 20 years, not just the last 10, over the last 20 years, households the growth in households is balances in savings account, that growth number has steadily diminished. So 20 साल पहले savings account growth was 20% के आसपास. That growth in savings account is now 10%. So what Indian households have done is increasingly they've shifted their savings away from savings accounts and into the stock market. And not just into the stock market, data from SEBI and AMFI suggests that over the last year, Indian households have almost exclusively invested in small cap funds. Right? At one of the most overvalued junctures in Indian history in small cap stocks, Indian households have taken money out of their savings accounts and put it in small cap stocks. This is the kind of thing which gives capitalism a bad name, right? Some of the most financially stretched people in the country have been incented, encouraged, coaxed into taking money out of savings accounts and loading up on small cap funds at a point where they're the highest valuation peaks. You can understand what consequences will have. And as if this weren't bad enough, right? There's growing data that households have borrowed money to invest in the stock markets. In fact, the former chairman of ICICI, KV Kamath Saab, said this in an Economic Times interview a couple of months ago, that there's growing evidence that households have borrowed money to invest in the stock market. In fact, recently when you and I went to Bijnor district in UP, we saw an example of that, right? We had gone to a prominent high street banks. An illiterate man came and took a 10 lakh loan from the bank. And he said that he will invest that money in futures and options in the stock market, right? There's another way to identify this problem. As we discussed, roughly 40 million middle class Indians pay income taxes, right? वो साफ डेटा है भारत सरकार का. There are 170 million retail investors in the stock market. That means करीबन roughly conservatively 100 million people, 10 करोड़ लोग, उनके पास टैक्स भरने के पैसे नहीं है लेकिन स्टॉक मार्केट में सट्टा करने का पैसा है. It's highly likely they're doing stock market satta using borrowed money. So from a savings perspective, leaving aside the debt perspective, from a savings perspective, I think we're heading into a major challenge as well.
Okay, that is really concerning, and we'll have to see how that evolves. But don't you think that this is going to be a little cyclical? Because you mentioned earlier that our education system, the higher education system, is one of the best in the world currently, and one of the best actually, and that the graduates which are coming out are of reasonable quality. So don't you think that their employability will also rise in the coming years, and that will lead to better income generation and will solve this issue? So why do you say that this is a structural issue and not a cyclical one?
You're right to call me out and saying that middle class की वजह से बढ़िया higher education system बढ़ा. But the challenge now seems to be that higher education system on which the government of India has spent so much money for 75 years, that seems to be also getting stuck, right? Effectively, we have a socialist education system in a capitalist country, right?
Nicely.
And in a way, you are the person responsible for this insight. संदेता ने मेरे को एक दिन समझाया था टैक्सी में बैठे बैठे कि पंगा क्या हो रहा है कि हमारे देश में we have a socialist education system in a capitalist country. उसका मतलब क्यों बोल रहे हैं हम ऐसा, right? So if you look at the data, right, last year 2024 में data suggests that 90% of graduates, 2024 में 80% of graduates couldn't get a job. मतलब freshly minted 2024 graduates, 80% couldn't get a job. In fact, high proportion of IIT graduates in 2024 couldn't get a job. If we focus on all graduates, पूरी graduates की आबादी पे अगर हम focus करें, करीबन 30% of graduates in India don't have a job. Now, this is the irony. ILO का काम, International Labour Organization का काम suggests that people in India who can't read and write, अनपढ़ लोगों में केवल 3% unemployment है. अनपढ़ लोगों में केवल 3% अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट है, ग्रेजुएट्स में 30% अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट है, राइट? एंड देयर इज अ रेंज ऑफ डेटा folks, there's a range of data which suggests that graduate, the university education in India neither increases your earnings nor increases your probability of employment, right? So this is a hammer blow, I think, to the whole construct of the middle class कि पढ़ लिख के कुछ बनोगे जिंदगी में, बॉस बनोगे कैसे? Because the data is showing कि पढ़ लिख के कोई फायदा नहीं होता. There's plenty of data which shows that if you look at earnings, the best thing to do is stop studying after class 12. Class 12 pass outs have the best earnings, and they seem to be significantly better earnings than people who go on to do graduation. And as I said, the ILO data couldn't be more stark. अनपढ़ लोगों की 3% अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रेट है, ग्रेजुएट्स की 30% की अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रेट है, राइट? सो एजुकेशन क्रेडेंशियलिंग, and linking this back to the 47 phenomenon, मिडिल क्लास का ऑब्सेशन इज एजुकेशन क्रेडेंशियलिंग, राइट? ये बीएससी होगा, वो बीकॉम होगा, वो पीएचडी होगा, एमएससी होगा, आईआईटी में ये रैंक आएगी, जेई में, मेडिकल एंट्रेंस में वो रैंक आएगी. दिस होल ऑब्सेशन विद क्रेडेंशियलिंग has meant that much of what passes for education in India seems to be useless in the job market. And remember, the more AI advances in the office, the more robotization advances in the factory, the less useful this credentialed education will be.
So, as you were saying this, as you were explaining this whole phenomenon about credentialing, I recalled my conversation with my family members and my friends, and we had the exact same discussion. And this is what came out of it, that credentialing is not really important, but everyone seemed to be very fussed about it. So far we've talked about the economic factors that have led to this squeeze on the Indian middle class. Are there any social or political factors you reckon that have also sort of exacerbated the issue?
Let me just put it in numerical terms, right? Government data, income tax data shows 40 million Indians, income taxpayers. Assume that these are families with two people, right? So, करीबन 80 million voters, right? 40 million income taxpayers from the middle class, 80 million voters. Now, just to contextualize 80 million voters, total voters in the 2024 general election was 640 million, right? So, the middle class is barely 10, maximum 15% of the voting population. And as you know, many of them go on holiday on election day. So I suspect from a vote bank perspective, politicians don't lose too much sleep about these people, right? For politicians, this class of Indians are the people who paid the taxes, 70% income tax. Middle class भरती है, मेरे ख्याल से आधा GST payment भी, 40 से 50% GST भी middle class भरती है. So the middle class's job is to be paying the country's taxes. करीबन आधा tax load country का middle class carry करती है. But from a vote bank perspective, they're roughly 10% of the vote bank. And you can understand, right? If I was a politician, I would say this is perfect. Yeah, these people are politically not very powerful, economically very good for me. पैसा देते हैं मेरे को, in tax देते हैं. And that's where the middle class's status currently hangs, right? And in a way, you can remember, this is a democracy. Voting is power. Voting is raw political power. So you can contextualize everything. The economic decline, the high indebtedness, the low propensity of graduates to get jobs, right? You can contextualize all of it in the context of political powerlessness of the middle class.
I mean, this brings me to my next question, and it's sort of out of my curiosity. Has this ever happened elsewhere in the world? Because, I mean, we are seeing this in India right now, and it's pretty new for us, given that we're a developing economy, we are a young country. But is there a Western precedent to this so that we can, sort of see what has happened there? And do you think we'll go on the same line as those countries?
So the job market piece that's playing out in India is ball by ball a replay of what took place in the West through the 80s, 90s and noughties, right? The political piece is slightly different. The Western political voter base thoda sa alag hai, but the job market piece is a ball by ball replay. So the people who first spotted this, right, and it's quite remarkable that although 80s, 90s mein baat shuru hui, the replacement of people in offices and factories, the replacement of middle management in offices and factories by machines, ये 80s 90s में शुरू हुआ, but 2003 three American economists caught on to it, right? And they wrote a very famous paper in 2003 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Those of us who study economics end up studying from what's called the QJE frequently. तो QJE में 2003 में पेपर का नाम काफी बोरिंग सा था, right? It was called the skill content of recent technological change and empirical exploration, right? But ये famous paper बना करीबन 10-12 साल पहले वेस्ट के पूरा political foundations को इस पेपर ने हिला दिया. क्यों किया? इन पेपर के ऑथर थे three people, David Autor, Frank Levy and Richard Murnane. So we'll call it the ALM paper after Autor, Levy and Murnane. Famous paper. What this said was that remember they said this in 2003 and then turned out to be incredibly prescient. They said that what's happening in the West is that the way technology is evolving, it's helping the poor, the unskilled worker, and it's helping the skilled workers. CEO जैसे लोग अच्छा करेंगे, shop floor में साधारण unskilled लोग अच्छा करेंगे, the बीच का the middle management layer will get decimated, right? So let's think of an example of this, right? So through the 70s, 80s, CNC machines, right? CNC machines are computer controlled machines which do a lot of the hard work in factories, right? A CNC machine would replace a skilled worker. Much of the work that a CNC machine does in factories around the world today in the 60s, 70s would have been done by a skilled middle class worker, right? A CNC machine effectively is a very specific type of robot which does a specific type of high precision manufacturing, right? CNC machines and robots through the 80s and 90s got rid of the middle management layer, and what it led was creation of machines which workers could operate by themselves, right? So 70s, 80s, 90s, Japan and the West created a whole layer of robotization which workers could operate by themselves without much supervisory intervention, right? And Murnane, Levy and Otto, Levy and Merlin, ALM, Otto, Levy and Merlin spotted this, and they wrote the paper in 2003. Remarkably, even after they wrote the paper, ऑफिसेज में सेम चीज हुआ, राइट? सो व्हेन दे रोट द पेपर फैक्ट्रीज में हो रहा था between 2003 and 2023, right? Offices got highly automated, right? So the rise of algorithms resulted in a lot of coders who would do brute force coding algorithms, and rise of AI resulted in coders losing the job. So in the recent earnings call, Alphabet said that one third of their coding work is now done by AI, by bots, right? So if you think about clerical jobs, secretarial jobs in offices, those got killed in the last 20 years. That will carry on happening. So this construct that Murnane, Levy and Otto identified, right, the ALM construct, it was applicable to the West from 80s, 90s through to the current day. It's perfectly played out in India over the last 10 years, right? Anything which is routine, anything which is repetitive is getting butchered in our country. Those jobs are getting taken out of the ecosystem, right? So if you look at what's called the annual survey of industries, Nandita, it's a भारत सरकार का सर्वे जो आप ही dig out करते हो. So annual survey का industry data जो नंदिता ने dig out किया है, what that is showing is that supervisory and managerial workers are forming an ever smaller part of the industrial workforce. So FY14, 2014 में supervisory and managerial workers were 10% of the workforce. In 2023, they were 9% of the workforce. And as AI kicks in, I suspect the supervisory and managerial workforce will die away, right? So we're getting a polarization of the workplace, right? वो फैक्ट्री हो या ऑफिस, नीचे में जूनियर लोग हैं, ऊपर में सीईओ टाइप लोग हैं, बीच में किसी की जरूरत नहीं है, राइट? एंड इन अ वे द वे यू एंड आई हैव वर्कड इज एक्चुअली एन एग्जांपल ऑफ दिस, राइट? यू जॉइंड अस एज अ ग्रेजुएट, you worked with me. Even though you were a graduate, you knew much of what had to be done because all the resources of the net, social media, AI is available to you. You learned coding, you learned Python, and you were able to get much of the work done, which I suspect 20 years ago, someone 10 years older than you would have done. Right? So if you see your own career, right, it's a great example of how you can graduate, do pretty advanced work 1 or 2 or 3 years out of college. And if I look back, right, 20 years ago, someone in their early 30s would be doing what you are doing in your mid 20s, right? So this aspect of the office place where junior people की demand है, बहुत senior लोगों की demand है, बीच में किसी की ज़रूरत नहीं है. That hollowing out hits the middle class really hard. It hit them in the West. You could argue the rise of Brexit and Trump is a manifestation of this, but the same thing is happening in India today.
That's quite concerning because we are hitting that stage that the West has, but at a much, I mean, we are multiples below the per capita income that the West is at. So obviously they are really rich. The middle class throughout the 50s, 60s did really well, earned a lot of money, created assets. All of those things were already in place. We haven't even gotten to that stage, which makes this quite concerning for a lot of people in the country. So I just wanted to, with that, I wanted to get ahead and ask you that the government recently in the FY26 budget announced a tax break for the middle class. So, do you think that the government is finally taking cognizance of this? I know you said that it doesn't really make sense for them to cater to this kind of category of people who are obviously adding a lot of money into their kitty for political purposes, but aren't really that significant when it comes to the vote bank. But they seem to be announcing a few SOPs and tax breaks for them.
Yeah. So let me address both the points you made. You made a very interesting point that all of this is happening in the West when they are at 10x our per capita income. It is right, and that's the nature of a globalized economy. So the same labor-saving technology, AI is a labor-saving technology. The same labor-saving technology which is invaluable for the West is also being applied in India to the detriment of Indian jobs. But that is the nature of a global economy. Now, let's come to your political wala point, right? This is, I think, great for Indian politicians. Because remember, the going back again to 47, right? The anglicized middle class that was created by the British took charge of India post 47. They are gradually dying away, right? They are gradually dying away, and as they get hollowed out because of the dynamics of the workplace, the ALM phenomenon, which is middle wala management wala layer gets hollowed out. Effectively, the politician is left with just two constituencies to focus on. One is the promoter CEO wala constituency, which is running big companies, which naturally will want to run those companies very profitably, and all that the government needs to do, in inverted commas, all that the government needs to do is help folks like me run companies like Marcellus ever more profitably, right? So that's the first piece. That's a job that most governments are happy to do because they say let's help the promoter CEO class make more money. वो ज़्यादा taxes भरेंगे, फिर country आगे बढ़ेगा. And then the other class of people, the masses, the government is happy to give direct benefit transfer, right? My reading is increasingly India, whether at the state level or the central level, the government will do heavy duty direct benefit transfer using the upside from economic growth. There'll be heavy duty direct benefit transfer. From an obvious perspective, it helps the government curry favor with board banks, but there's also a human dimension to it, right? Through DBT, you're getting money for education, fuel, housing into people's bank accounts, and there's a human dimension which suggests that from in a democracy, you need to look after people, right? And if we look at what's happened since the 2024 general elections, it's fit this narrative, I think, perfectly. So in the 24 general elections, I'm sure everybody watching knows, right? The ruling dispensations vote seat count fell from 300 to करीबन 240, right? And my reading is they've responded to it pretty proactively. So if you look at the February 25 union budget and the middle class tax cut, it's a nod in the direction middle class saying चलो up to 12 लाख आपका income tax माफ करते हैं क्योंकि आप लोगों की इतनी भयंकर पिटाई हो चुकी है already job market में and from an income perspective. But I think even more interesting I found were the assembly elections. So 2024 general election के बाद 3 assembly election हुए, हरियाणा, महाराष्ट्र and Delhi. And in all three, the BJP won with a landslide, and in all three, the program was broadly similar, right? Welfare benefits, especially to women. The more women vote in elections now than men. So welfare benefits, especially to women, and then more social security type benefits for housing, for food and fuel. And it's proving to be a hit. No surprises. We're a democracy. If you give poor people small sums of money, you can win major election victories. And I think this template in Indian politics is here to stay. This will help the poor. This will lead to a new, I think, activation of the poor in politics. The concern is what happens to the middle class in this political paradigm, where the rich are in good shape, the poor are getting looked after by our politicians. Middle class ka mai baap kaun hai?
That's quite interesting. So now let's come to the most important aspect of the whole podcast, and I think this is what our viewers are also most concerned about, is the implications on investments. How do you see investments going forward? What should be loading up on? What should be wary of? How to go about it?
So before we come to the sectoral piece, before I come to that, I think पहला चीज I would like to tell people is ये cyclical slowdown है. COVID के बाद 2-3 साल economy was in great shape. We are entered a cyclical slowdown. It's going to stay here with us for a few quarters. The stock market is overvalued. I've said this several times in the last 6 months. The stock market is overvalued. We are in a slowdown, and therefore be careful about loading up on the stock market, the Indian stock market at this juncture. Diversify out of Indian equities. If you can diversify into global equities, into other countries, do so. And within India, diversify out of small and mid cap, at least into large cap, if not into other asset classes, right? So be careful. Time to be cautious here, given the slowing economy with rich valuations in the market. Coming to sectoral implications, Aditya, तो पहला वाला तो जाहिर है, given all everything that we discussed, right? We're looking at an extended slowdown in consumption. Government का data already shows consumption is growing at the lowest pace. In recent quarters, consumption is growing at the lowest pace since COVID, right? So 5.3% was the recent consumption print. Just to for those who forgotten, pre-COVID consumption was growing at around 7-8%. So uske comparison mein 5.3% is a pretty modest print, and clearly core middle class consumption categories, scooters, entry level cars, consumer durables, FMCG products, उसमें जो slowdown बैठ गया है, ये कुछ quarter बरकरार रहेगा, right? Given the challenges the middle class faces. दूसरा I think challenge आएगा real estate में. Whilst I'm not anticipating major drops in real estate prices, right? While I'm not anticipating that, it's clear that already in our big cities and indeed in the small towns you and I are visiting, already supply of flats is exceeding demand for flats, right? That's not shouldn't be surprising, right? पैसे नहीं है middle class के पास, वो जाके flat कहाँ से लेगा? So supply of flats is already exceeding demand for flats. That typically in India is a precursor to price stagnation in real estate, right? India में time after time होता है, since time immemorial 3-4 साल तेजी के बाद इतनी सप्लाई आ जाती है कि डिमांड से ज़्यादा हो जाती है. I think real estate we've already reached that juncture. I'd expect to see therefore weak demand for building materials this point in, right? And lastly, the combination of rising non-performing assets for the banks and NBFCs. Remember, उन्होंने middle class को पैसे दिए हैं, middle class के पास चुकाने की क्षमता नहीं है, तो non-performing assets I think continue rising for especially NBFCs, to some extent the banks as well. And in parallel with this obsession to take out money from savings accounts and plonk it into the stock market, there's also a liquidity squeeze on our lenders. तो lenders की दोनों तरफ से बज रही है, एक तो NPA बढ़ रहा है और दूसरी तरफ उनकी liquidity की कमी है, which is why the lenders are having to jack up deposit rates to attract savings, right? So difficult times ahead. My suggestion to people is, if you do want to invest in these difficult times, look at export centric companies, IT में, pharma में. Look at companies in the domestic medical sector, hospitals, diagnostics, जहाँ पे demand टूटने की उतनी संभावनाएं नहीं है.
Right. That was super interesting. Thank you so much. So folks, I mean, the message is pretty clear that there are tough times ahead of us and we need to sort of focus on our health, on the way we live, the consumption, everything has to be focused on. And most importantly, where you invest, how you manage your money will be the most important. So just focus on that. Take these suggestions that Saurabh has very kindly shared with us very seriously.
I think let me just end by saying capitalism is Darwinian, right? Capitalism is Darwinian. So both in the context of corporate life and in the context of individuals like us, I think the next 2 to 3 years, the stronger companies will do better than the weaker ones. And I think stronger individuals, people who are able to keep their head in difficult times, keep their financial balance in difficult times, will do well. It is a cyclical downturn. We will come out of it in a few quarters, and to thrive in the new recovery, the new economic recovery, which will come and in due course. I think all of us need to hold our resources and our resolve together in this downturn.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Saurabh, and thank you for coming to this episode.
Thanks, Anita. Thank you for doing this.